The most powerful woman in Silicon Valley once looked a room full of male investors dead in the eyes and said, "I don't need any of you. Not for capital. Not for validation. Not for survival." And for 34 years, she had made good on that promise. Before we go any further, drop your location in the comments right now. Tell me your city, your country, what time it is wherever you are watching from. I love seeing where people are tuning in from all over the world. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get into it. Her name was Nadia Wells, founder and CEO of Wells Nexus Corporation, a data security and defense tech empire valued at just under $45 billion. In every boardroom she had ever entered, she was the most dangerous person in the room. And everyone knew it. But the story of how Nadia Wells became Nadia Wells doesn't begin in a boardroom. It begins in a kitchen in Akron, Ohio. Her father was an engineer, brilliant, methodical, and entirely absent in every way that actually counted. He provided for the family financially with the precision of a man running a logistics operation. Food appeared. Tuition was paid. The house was warm. But warmth in the emotional sense, that was a currency he had never learned to spend. Her mother was a woman who had once wanted to be an architect. She had the talent. She had the acceptance letter from a prestigious program. She did not, however, have a husband who believed her ambitions were compatible with being a wife. Nadia watched her mother fold that acceptance letter and place it in a drawer. She never forgot that. She was 7 years old. By the time she was 12, Nadia had developed a philosophy that would carry her further than any degree or mentor ever could. The only person you can fully trust is the one whose interests are identical to your own. And since no one else's interests would ever be perfectly identical to hers, the conclusion was clean. You build alone. You rise alone. You need no one. Her teachers called her intense. Her classmates called her cold. Her mother called her remarkable. In quiet moments, when no one else was listening, she graduated valedictorian. Full scholarship to MIT. Double major in computer science and applied mathematics, with a minor in political theory that she pursued entirely out of personal curiosity, entirely off the beaten path, in seminar rooms where other students argued about Machiavelli while she took notes and thought, "These people think this is theoretical." She built her first company at 23. It was a cybersecurity consultancy, 3 people in a Boston apartment, surviving on grant money and audacity. Within 4 years, it had 14 government contracts and was turning away business. She sold it at 28 for $90 million, walked into the closing meeting alone, and signed the papers without once looking like a woman who had just changed her life. 2 years later, she started Wells Nexus. The premise was deceptively simple. In a world where nations were increasingly waging war through data rather than bullets, the most valuable thing you could sell a government wasn't weapons. It was certainty. The ability to know, with absolute confidence, that your systems were clean, your communications were secure, and your enemies could not see inside your walls. Nadia sold certainty, and she was extraordinarily good at it. By the time she was 41, Wells Nexus had offices on 5 continents, security clearances in 11 countries, and a client list that read like the guest roster at a summit no journalist had ever been allowed to attend. She had been on the cover of 3 major business publications. She had been called a visionary by people who used that word like a compliment, and a threat by people who meant it as both. She had also been divorced once, a brief, 3-year marriage in her mid-30s to a man who was, by all accounts, exceptional.
Smart. Kind.
Supportive. A man who had loved her completely, and without condition. She had ended it herself. Not because she didn't care for him.
She did.
More than she was comfortable admitting. She ended it because she realized one morning, standing in the kitchen of their shared apartment watching him read the news over coffee, that she had begun to need his presence in her day. That his absence on travel weeks created a specific, identifiable ache. That she had started to make small decisions, what time to come home, which events to attend, with the quiet weight of his preferences on the scale. And meeting someone, to Nadia Wells, was the beginning of the end of everything she had built. She filed the papers 4 months later, He never fully understood why. She told herself she didn't owe him an explanation he would find satisfying. What she did not tell herself, because she was very good at not examining certain things too closely, was that the real reason she left was fear. Not of him, of herself, of how much smaller she might become if she ever truly let herself be loved. So she walked out of that marriage the same way she walked out of every room, cleanly, efficiently, and entirely on her own terms. And for 6 years after that, she had not allowed anyone close enough to test her resolve. Her executives walked on eggshells around her. Senators returned her calls within the hour. And every man who had ever underestimated her had the career scars to show for it. But the one thing her systems could never predict was the sniper positioned on the rooftop across from her hotel. It was a bitter Friday evening in Chicago. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since noon, and the wind off Lake Michigan had the particular cruelty that only Midwesterners understand. Not just cold, but intentional, like the city itself was reminding you who was in charge. Nadia had just wrapped a private dinner with 3 of the most influential defense ministers on the continent, inside the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the lake. The skyline was stunning. The conversation had been sharp, productive, and entirely on her terms. She had spent 3 hours steering the discussion with the patience of someone who had done this so many times that the performance of it was invisible. She let Minister Haraldsson of Norway believe he had arrived at her preferred conclusion independently. She allowed the British minister, a nervous man named Croft who sweated lightly whenever numbers above 9 figures were mentioned, to feel that his concerns had been heard and addressed, even as she subtly neutralized every one of them. The third minister, a compact, precise woman from South Korea named Bae, was the only one at the table who played at anything close to Nadia's level, and those two had spent the last 90 minutes in a wordless, entirely cordial battle of positioning that neither of the men at the table had noticed. Nadia respected Minister Bae. She also intended to win. She walked out of the private dining room with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had once again bent the world slightly in her direction. Her security detail flanked her as the elevator descended to the lobby. 4 agents, decorated backgrounds, cutting-edge earpieces, and not a single one of them noticed the man standing near the hotel bar who had been watching the elevator doors for the past 40 minutes. He was lean,
Composed.
the kind of still that wasn't rest, it was readiness. Dark jacket, black slacks, eyes that moved like cameras, cataloging every exit, every shadow, every angle of the room without ever appearing to look at anything directly. He was nursing a glass of something amber, and he had barely touched it.
Aprop.
The glass wasn't a drink. It was a reason to stand somewhere without appearing to wait. His name was Park Seo-jin, and he hadn't come to Chicago for the lakefront views. Seo-jin had flown in from Seoul 72 hours earlier on a private charter that was registered to a holdings company that was owned by a trust that was administered by a law firm in Liechtenstein. On paper, he ran a private acquisitions firm with offices in Seoul, Singapore, and Dubai. The firm had a website, professionally designed, deliberately vague, exactly the kind of corporate presence that signaled serious money without inviting scrutiny. Beneath the paper, he was something far more complicated. In certain circles across East Asia, his name was spoken the way people speak about weather. Quietly,
Carefully.
with the understanding that it could change everything without warning. He was not a criminal in the way films portray them. There were no visible tattoos, no theatrical threats, no entourage of large men in identical suits. He was a man who had spent 15 years studying how power actually moved through the world, not through governments or corporations, though those were the visible machinery, but through the invisible arrangements between people who could not afford to be seen making arrangements. He had started improbably as an interpreter. Fluent in 5 languages by the time he was 22, he had been recruited to serve as a private translator for a series of meetings between Korean industrial interests and Pacific Rim intermediaries that had nothing to do with industry. He was sharp, discreet, and possessed of a quality that made him invaluable in rooms where fortunes and fates were being quietly negotiated. He made everyone feel like the most important person present, even when they were not. Within 3 years, he was no longer translating conversations. He was having them himself. He built a network, Not by acquiring assets or accumulating debts, but by being genuinely useful to people who could not trust most of the people around them. He solved problems that could not be solved through official channels. He connected people who needed to be connected without anyone knowing they were connected. He was, in the most accurate sense of the word, a fixer, but operating at a geopolitical altitude where the problems being fixed had the potential to destabilize markets, start conflicts, or quietly end careers at the highest levels. He had rules. He didn't work for governments directly, too many competing masters. He didn't take contracts involving civilians without their knowledge. And he didn't do anything that couldn't survive his own moral scrutiny, which was more rigorous than most people assumed, and which had cost him profitable arrangements on more than one occasion. Tonight, someone had placed a contract on Nadia Wells, and CO Jean had spent 2 days tracking it down before it could be collected. Not out of charity. He was not naive enough to pretend his motives were pure. If Nadia died before the U.S. government finalized Wells' Nexus's surveillance infrastructure deal, it would collapse a very delicate arrangement that kept 3 separate criminal organizations from going to war in the Pacific. The arrangement depended on the deal closing. The deal depended on Nadia. Nadia's survival was, therefore, a geopolitical necessity that happened to align with his interests. That was what he told himself. He had identified the shooter an hour before Nadia finished dinner. The man was professional, patient. Positioned on the rooftop of the parking structure directly across from the hotel's side entrance, the exit Nadia's security team always favored because it avoided press and it allowed for a clean vehicle approach. Whoever had provided the shooter with operational intelligence about her team's protocols had done their homework. That told CO Jean 2 things. The people behind the contract had inside access to at least one person close to Nadia's operation, and they had been planning this for considerably longer than it appeared. He had already made one call. His people were moving toward the rooftop, but the timing was going to be tight. The moment the elevator opened and Nadia stepped into the lobby, something changed in the room's geometry. It always did when she entered a space. She carried authority the way certain people carry height, not aggressively, simply as a fact of the air around them. Her security lead, a former Secret Service agent named Harris, fell in beside her automatically, already touching his earpiece, already running the standard protocol. Side entrance. Vehicles in position. 40 seconds to the car. They crossed the lobby. The revolving side door was ahead. CO Jean was already moving. He cut across the lobby at an angle that looked, to anyone watching, like a man heading toward the exit. He timed it precisely. He had done versions of this before. Interception in a moving crowd was a skill that required practice and a particular comfort with a half-second between action and consequence. He reached Nadia's position exactly as her lead agent pushed open the revolving door. He said nothing. He simply put one hand firmly on her shoulder and redirected her body sideways in a single fluid motion, 2 feet left, behind the frame of the door, in a movement so controlled and quick that her security team processed it as a threat of full beat after it was already over. A sharp crack split the air. The shot punched through the glass panel of the revolving door, exactly where her torso had been half a second earlier. For one frozen moment, the lobby went absolutely still. Then everything moved at once. Her security team exploded, shouting, drawing, pushing Nadia toward the thick concrete pillar that flanked the entrance. Hotel guests scattered. Someone screamed from the bar area. Glass sprayed across the floor. But CO Jean was already crouching beside her, back to the pillar, positioning himself between her body and the open sight line with the calm efficiency of a man running a drill he had rehearsed many times. His voice was low, completely level. "Stay down. My people have the shooter. It'll be over in 40 seconds. Nadia stared at him. She was breathing hard, the body's autonomic response to sudden proximity to death, which no amount of composure could fully override. But her eyes were sharp, already working, already running calculations. "Who are you?" she asked. "Someone who just saved your life." That wasn't the question. He almost smiled. Just the corners. Not quite. 38 seconds later, his phone vibrated once against his leg. "It's done," he said, and stood up slowly, brushing a fragment of glass from his sleeve with the mild irritation of a man who had just noticed a scuff on good shoes. Her security team swarmed him immediately. 3 weapons raised. Harris's hand on his shoulder, hard. Nadia held up one hand. They stopped. She stood up herself, straightened her coat, looked at this stranger, this utterly composed, entirely unrattled stranger who had just pushed her out of the path of a bullet, with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for hostile acquisition targets. "You're going to explain yourself," she said. "Not a request. Whenever you're ready to listen." Harris was already on his radio, running the name of the exit through the protocol, reassessing everything. Nadia could feel the operational chaos reorganizing around her. In an hour there would be FBI involvement. In 2 hours, there would be questions she could not answer without answering others she wasn't ready to answer. "Give me something with your name on it," she said. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, so that no one with a weapon had a reason to make a decision, and produced a matte black card. Small. Minimal. Just a name and a number.
No logo.
No title. No indication of what he was or what he did. Then he turned and walked into the now-recovering crowd, past a hotel manager who was already on his phone, past a group of stunned guests, through the far door, and into the cold Chicago night before her team had fully processed that he was leaving. Nadia looked down at the card. Park Seo-jin. That was it, which bothered her far more than she expected. She spent the next 3 days doing what she always did with disruptions. She systematized them. The FBI investigation was handled through her legal team, with the carefully calibrated cooperation of a woman who knew exactly how much to give a federal agency and not a gram more. The shooter, when identified, turned out to be a contractor with European operational history and no direct traceable connections to any client. A professional ghost. The kind of hire that told you the people behind the contract were not amateurs and did not particularly expect to be caught. Her internal security team ran the name Park Seo-jin through every database they had access to, legal and otherwise. The results were thin. Deliberately thin. An acquisitions firm registered in Singapore. A LinkedIn profile with no photo and minimal history. A few references in Korean business press, always peripheral. Mentioned as attending a summit, noted as a party to a closing, never the subject of a story. A digital footprint carefully maintained to project the minimum necessary surface area. The thinness itself was the information. Someone had been very intentional about keeping this man's true profile invisible, which told her he operated in spaces where visibility was dangerous, and which suggested a level of operational sophistication that her own considerable resources could not easily penetrate. She called the number on the 4th day. He picked up on the 2nd ring. "Took longer than I expected," he said. She bristled. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Act like you knew I'd call." "Didn't I?" She didn't answer that. "I want a meeting. Somewhere neutral." "Name the city." "I'm in New York tomorrow." "I know." That landed strangely. She filed it away, in the mental folder she kept for things that required further examination. "There's a members-only gallery in Tribeca. Be there at 8. "I'll be there at 7:50. He was there at 7:45. The gallery was the kind of place that didn't advertise itself. You knew about it or you didn't, and the distinction tracked almost perfectly with a certain kind of wealth and taste. The building had no sign. The door was unmarked. Inside, the space was long and low-lit, with concrete floors and white walls and pieces that ranged from quietly beautiful to aggressively confrontational, sometimes within the same work. Nadia had been a member for 4 years. She came when she needed to think in a space that had no meetings scheduled in it. She found Seo-jin in front of a large abstract piece, deep blues and fractured blacks, something volcanic about it, with genuine attention on his face. Not the performed attention of a man trying to seem cultured. The real kind. The kind where you forget you're being observed. She noted that. She sat across from him at a quiet table in the gallery's lounge. A staff member materialized with water and wine, and then vanished with the discretion the membership paid for. "Someone paid to have me killed," she said. "I want to know who."
No preamble. No pleasantries.
She didn't do pleasantries with people whose value she hadn't established. Seo-jin set down his glass. A consortium of 3 private defense contractors based out of Luxembourg. They've been monitoring your government negotiations for 8 months. You're about to make them irrelevant. Their entire European surveillance infrastructure becomes redundant the moment your deal closes. They decided to solve that problem the old-fashioned way. Names. I can give you 2 of the 3. The third is structured behind enough layers that even my sources haven't reached the bottom of it yet.
Give me what you have. He did.
2 names, 2 corporate structures, a summary of their lobbying connections, and the identity of 2 intermediaries they had used historically for contracted work. He delivered it the way someone delivers a report, organized, detailed, without editorializing. She listened without writing anything down. She had a memory for operational detail that had never failed her. When he finished, she looked at him. How do you know this? Because 2 of those contractors have historically used intermediaries that operate in my world. And your world is what, exactly? Complicated. Try harder. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table. No performance in it. Just the posture of someone deciding how honest to be and choosing honestly. I manage relationships between powerful people who can't be seen managing their own relationships. Sometimes that's financial. Sometimes it's information. Sometimes it's making problems disappear before they become disasters. That's a very polished way of saying you're organized crime. That's a very American way of categorizing something far more nuanced. Enlighten me. He was quiet for a moment. The line between legitimate power and illegitimate power is mostly a line drawn by whoever currently holds legitimate power. Most of the arrangements that keep the world functioning, that prevent certain conflicts from igniting, that ensure certain resources keep flowing, that maintain the stability that allows economies to function, none of those arrangements are in any official record. They happen in rooms like this one, between people like us. I run a legal company, she said. You do. You also just spent 3 hours at a private dinner positioning a $45 billion surveillance deal that 3 governments will use to monitor populations who have not consented to being monitored. We're both operating in the gray, Nadia. The difference is your gray has a corporate structure and mine doesn't. She held his gaze for a long moment. She did not like being challenged. She had to admit, deeply respected competent challenge when she encountered it. Why did you save my life? She asked. Honestly, I told you. Your survival protects a balance I have a vested interest in maintaining. So, it was entirely transactional. Completely. She nodded slowly. Strangely, unexpectedly, that answer was the one that respected her most. It treated her as a rational actor, not a person to be managed with flattery. It offered her no emotional theater to navigate. It was simply the truth, as he understood it, delivered without cushioning. She appreciated that more than she knew how to say. I want to keep talking, she said. About the consortium. What they're planning next. I assumed you would. Stop doing that. Knowing what you want. Saying it out loud. He almost smiled again. Closer this time. Same time next week, she said, standing. Here, or somewhere comparable. I'll find somewhere comparable. He did every time. Over the following weeks, the meetings moved between cities as their respective schedules demanded. A private dining room in Washington. A members club in Boston. A rooftop restaurant in Miami during a conference she was attending that he appeared at with the casual ease of a man who either had invitations to everything or needed them for nothing. He fed her intelligence on the consortium systematically. She used it with the precision of 3 decades of practice, deploying information as leverage in ways that were entirely above board and entirely devastating. Within 6 weeks, one of the named contractors had withdrawn from 2 government tender processes under circumstances that would never be publicly explained. The second was facing an internal audit triggered by an anonymous complaint to a regulatory body that Nadia had not filed personally, but had certainly known was coming. The third, the unnamed, layered one, remained. And it was the one that worried her. But the conversations kept extending beyond strategy. It started with an argument. They were in Washington, a private room at a club she had used for a decade, and the topic had drifted from the consortium to a broader question about a geopolitical situation in Southeast Asia that intersected with both their respective interests. She had taken a position. He had disagreed. Not diplomatically, Not gently, flatly, with the confidence of someone who had information she didn't and was willing to say so. She pushed back. He held his ground. For 45 minutes, they went back and forth with the focused intensity of two people who were not performing disagreement but genuinely having it. No raised voices.
No personal slights.
Just argument, clean, rigorous, each forcing the other to be more precise. At the end of it, she revised her position slightly.
So, did he?
It was the most intellectually alive she had felt in a conversation in years. Afterward, walking out, she caught herself thinking about it, turning the arguments over, identifying where she could have been sharper, where he had genuinely shown her something she hadn't seen. She couldn't remember the last time someone had done that. "You built something real," he told her one evening over coffee at her penthouse office. 3 weeks later, he had come to deliver an update on the consortium's movements and stayed 2 hours past the point where the update had been covered. Outside, New York performed its usual theater of light and noise 30 stories below. Most people at your level stopped building things a long time ago. They just protect what they have. "And what do you do?" she asked. "I make sure the infrastructure that holds the world together doesn't collapse while everyone's busy pretending it runs on goodwill." "That sounds lonely." He looked at her. A pause. Not evasion, consideration. "It is." There was something in that honesty she hadn't expected. Not because she thought him incapable of it, but because she knew from experience that men in positions like his tended to perform strength by refusing to acknowledge cost. They conflated vulnerability with weakness so consistently that they eventually couldn't tell the difference. He didn't do that. She filed it away. The way she filed many things about him, carefully, with the intention of examining it later, in conditions where she could think clearly. The problem was that thinking clearly about Seojin was becoming increasingly difficult. She noticed small things. The way he tracked entrances and exits in every room without appearing to, a habit so automatic it had become invisible to him, but not to her trained eye. The way he chose his words with a precision that other people would have called careful, but that she recognized as something more specific. Respect. He chose his words carefully with her because he considered her intelligence worth respecting, which was rarer than it had any right to be. She noticed that he never looked at her the way powerful men almost always eventually looked at her, with the particular mixture of desire and resentment that came from wanting something they also felt threatened by. He looked at her the way she imagined someone might look at a particularly interesting problem they found genuinely absorbing. Not a trophy. Not a conquest. Not an obstacle. A person.
She wasn't used to that.
She noticed that when he disagreed with her, which was often, he did it without any of the invisible apparatus men usually deployed when contradicting a woman in power.
No softening.
No half apology before the point. No performed uncertainty to make her feel less corrected. Just the disagreement, clean and direct, delivered with the assumption that she could handle it. She could, of course. But no one had assumed it this consistently in a very long time. She told herself it was professional respect. The acknowledgement between two skilled operators of each other's competence. That was all. She told herself this on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, she found herself wondering what he was doing. On Thursday, she caught herself, mid-meeting, composing the opening line of a message to him that had nothing to do with the consortium. She did not send it, but she noted that she had written it. The second attempt on her life came 6 weeks after Chicago. She was traveling to a private airstrip outside Dulles, a routine movement she made 4 or 5 times a year to access a charter flight that she used specifically because it bypassed commercial infrastructure. The route was known to her security team. It was not publicized. It was not supposed to be known to anyone else. The ambush had 3 vehicles. Armed men, 8 in total, coordinated, with the discipline of people who had rehearsed this. They had timed it for the 2-mile stretch of access road between the highway and the airstrip, where tree cover made aerial surveillance difficult and where her convoy would have no immediate exit options. It was, she would reflect later, a well-constructed operation. It lasted 11 minutes. Because Seojin's people had already been there. She never fully pieced together how he had known later. He told her that a contact in Luxembourg had flagged unusual movement among the consortium's security contractors 48 hours before, and he had taken it seriously enough to preposition. What she experienced in the moment was this. The convoy stopped at a barrier across the road. Her security team registered threat. And then, before the armed men could fully commit, a coordinated counteraction came from positions in the trees on both flanks that were so precisely placed that the ambush was compromised before it properly began. It did not end without violence. 2 of her security detail were injured, neither critically. Jean had a cut above his eyebrow that he addressed with the same energy he would give a minor inconvenience. When it was over, Nadia stood on the cold tarmac in the dark with emergency lights, painting the tree line red and blue. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. And she was experiencing the specific, disorienting sensation of having been, for the second time in 6 weeks, genuinely close to not surviving. Jean came to stand beside her. He didn't speak immediately. He read the moment correctly. She didn't need words, not yet. She needed a beat. So he stood with her in the cold and let the beat happen. After a moment, she asked, "When does this end?" "When they understand it's no longer worth the cost." "And you're going to make them understand that?" "I already started." She looked at him. The cut above his eye was bleeding slowly. There was a smudge of something on his jacket. He was the most composed person on the airstrip, and on a night that had included 8 armed men and a coordinated counterambush, that composure was not performance. It was who he was. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know. You should address that. In a minute." She held his gaze. The Washington night hummed around them, sirens in the middle distance, voices on radios, the structural noise of a situation being processed by people whose job was to process it. And in the middle of all of it, something shifted in her chest with the slow, irreversible movement of a thing that has been changing for a while and has only now become undeniable. She didn't name it. Not yet. But she didn't look away from it either. The weeks that followed were defined by their combination of professional intensity and something that neither of them formally acknowledged, and both of them clearly felt. Jean's network had begun applying pressure to the consortium from multiple directions simultaneously: financial, reputational, operational. He explained the strategy to her in pieces, always enough for her to see the logic, always leaving room for her to add her own moves. It was collaborative in a way that surprised her because she was accustomed to protecting her strategic thinking from everyone around her, and here she was sharing it with a man whose primary credential was that he had twice been between her and a bullet. She trusted him. The realization arrived without fanfare one morning in November, somewhere over the Atlantic on a flight to London. She was reviewing materials for a board presentation, and she found herself thinking about a tactical question she wanted Jean's perspective on, and it occurred to her that the reason she wanted his perspective was not because she lacked her own, but because she genuinely wanted to know what he thought. She trusted his judgment. She couldn't remember the last time she had said that about another person. She called him when she landed. "I have a question," she said. "Go ahead." "Do you think the third contractor is running independent of the first 2 at this point, or do you think they're still coordinated?" He considered it for 3 seconds. "Independent. The first 2 are in retreat. Anyone still coordinating with them is managing a liability, not an asset. If the third is still active, they have their own reasons." "I thought the same thing. Which means the deal itself is the target, not you personally. You were the expedient solution. If you're harder to remove, they'll look for another lever." "The Norwegian minister," she said. "I protect the Norwegian minister," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "You're very good at this." "So are you." "I know. I was complimenting you." "A beat." "Thank you." "Don't make it strange." "Too late. You already made it strange by saying something nice." She laughed before she could stop herself. A genuine one, brief, caught off guard. She hung up before she let herself think about what that meant. In December, the deal closed. Not without complications. The Norwegian minister's office did face a targeted leak of private communications, which Nadia had anticipated and had taken steps to contain 2 weeks prior. The leak landed with less than a quarter of its intended impact. The minister, for his part, was rattled but not broken and ultimately signed. It was Nadia's largest contract in the history of Wells Nexus. She should have been, in the hours after signing, in the specific state of focused satisfaction that had always been her closest approximation of happiness. The clean, solitary satisfaction of a goal achieved through her own effort. Instead, she found herself wanting to call CO Jean. She called her CFO first, then her legal team, then her head of operations. All the right calls, in the right order. Then she called CO Jean.
It closed, she said.
I know. Congratulations. How do you know? I have sources in The Hague. Of course you do.
She paused.
Thank you. For the past 3 months. He didn't say you're welcome, a response she would have found somehow inadequate. He said, it was a privilege to watch you work. She didn't know what to do with that. So she said, don't get sentimental. Never. They went to Florence in January, not for the reasons either of them would have admitted to at the time. Ostensibly, CO Jean's team was completing the final stage of dismantling the consortium's operational capability, a process that required his physical presence in Europe for the better part of 2 weeks. Ostensibly, Nadia was taking a long overdue break, a post-close reset that her executive team had been strongly recommending for months. The rented villa was outside the city in the hills. Old stone, long views, winter-bare vines on the terraces. CO Jean had sourced it through someone. She didn't ask how. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been there long enough to have opinions about the people who passed through it. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Mornings were work, she on her company operations, he on whatever the final stages of his operation required, each in separate rooms, occasionally crossing paths in the kitchen with the comfortable ease of 2 people who had somehow, without negotiating it, become domestically compatible. Afternoons were different. They walked through the hills, through the small towns that the winter kept free of tourists. They argued about history, about ethics, about a book she had given him that he had finished and disagreed with on 3 specific points. He cooked twice, with the competence of someone who had lived alone for a long time and had decided somewhere along the way that feeding yourself well was a form of self-respect. She had not cooked in years. She watched him once from the doorway of the kitchen with an expression she did not realize she was wearing. One evening, around the 3rd week, they had dinner on the terrace despite the cold, wrapped in coats, with a fire going in the stone pit at the terrace's edge. The valley below them had disappeared into darkness, and the only lights were distant farms and the constellations that winter gave back to you after the haze of warmer months burned them away. She asked him something she had been carrying since October. Why did you stay involved this long? The balance you were protecting, that was secured months ago. He was quiet for a moment, watching the valley. It stopped being about the balance, he said. When? He turned to look at her. Probably around the time you called me annoying for being right. She laughed, actually laughed, full and unguarded, and it surprised them both. She was not a woman who laughed like that. She had a professional laugh, precisely calibrated, that she deployed in appropriate social contexts. This was something different. This was the sound of someone who had forgotten, for one undefended second, to manage the impression she was making. You are annoying when you're right, she said, when she'd recovered. You're insufferable when you're wrong. I'm never wrong. You were wrong about not needing anyone. The silence that followed was not the silence of a challenge hanging in the air. It was the silence that settles between 2 people when something true has just been said and neither of them needs to add anything to it, because the truth is already standing there, quietly, waiting for them to catch up to it. Nadia looked out at the dark valley. She thought about a drawer in Akron, Ohio. A folded acceptance letter. A woman who had made herself smaller. She thought about a marriage she had ended not because it had failed but because it had started to matter. She thought about 34 years of building walls that looked like strength. It terrified me, she said finally. Needing someone. I know. It still does. I know that too. She turned to look at him. You're not going to tell me it's going to be fine.
No. Good.
I wouldn't believe you. I know. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to need me. I'm not asking you for anything. Then what are you doing? He thought about it, genuinely thought, the way he always did, without performing an answer before he had one. "I'm just here," he said. "I don't need you to be different. I don't need you to be softer or smaller or more available than you are. I'm just here, as long as that's useful to you. And if it stops being useful, then I'll still have had this." She looked at him for a long time in the cold dark. There were 1,000 things she could have said. She was a woman built from language. She had talked her way into boardrooms and out of disasters, had negotiated with senators and argued with defense ministers, had spent her career turning words into architecture. She didn't say any of them. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over beneath hers. They sat like that until the fire burned low, watching the valley hold its darkness, and neither of them said anything else, because sometimes the absence of words is the only honest response to something that language hasn't yet grown large enough to hold. The consortium was fully dismantled by March. The third contractor, the unnamed, layered one, turned out to be a shell controlled by a mid-tier European intelligence operative who had been running a side arrangement for personal financial gain, entirely unauthorized by his agency, and who discovered in February that the combination of CO Jean's network and Nadia Wells' legal team was a force he was comprehensively unequipped to survive. He surfaced at The Hague in March with a lawyer and a cooperation agreement. Nadia was in Singapore when she heard. She texted CO Jean 4 words, "It's over. You win." His response came back in seconds. "We win." Different thing. She put her phone down, looked out the window at the harbor. She was smiling. She noted that. She noted it, and did not immediately file it away for later analysis. She just let it be there, the smile, the warmth in her chest, the specific lightness of a person who has put something down that they have been carrying so long they stopped noticing the weight.
She was still Nadia Wells.
She was still the woman who had told a room full of investors she needed none of them. That was still true. She didn't need them. The company was still hers. The work was still hers. The strength was still hers. But the man who had never asked her to be anything other than what she had quietly become, something her empire couldn't replace. Not a protector. Not an asset. A partner. The most powerful CEO in America had built her entire identity around a single premise. She was complete on her own. And she was. Completeness was never the question. The question, the one she had been running from since a kitchen in Akron, since a folded letter in a drawer, since a marriage she had ended out of fear instead of wisdom, was never, "Are you enough?" It was, "Are you willing to let enough be more?"
She was.
Not because she had become smaller, not because she had learned to need, but because she had finally become secure enough in her own wholeness to let someone else stand beside it without it feeling like a threat. The right person doesn't make you smaller. They just make the world a little less cold. And somewhere between Chicago and Florence, and every heated argument in between, the woman who once said she needed no one had learned the most important thing her spreadsheets had never counted for. That strength and love are not opposites. That independence is not the same as isolation. And that the most courageous thing a powerful woman can do, after everything she has built, everything she has survived, every wall she has constructed, and every room she has commanded, is to let someone in.
Completely.
On her own terms. By her own choice.
Not because she needs to.
But because she wants to. And finally knowing the difference. If this story hit different, you already know what to do. Subscribe, because there's a whole world of stories like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment telling me which part got you, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.